Warning. DisAllusioned Podcast covers distressing themes such as coercive control, domestic violence, sexual assault, suicide, abuse, and human trafficking. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to DisAllusioned Podcast. I'm your host, Ari Sherwood, and today we are continuing on my new series, The Philosophy Behind Cults, focusing on the philosophy of authority and autonomy in relation to the cult experience. If you haven't checked it out yet, make sure to go back to episode 1 where I introduce this topic of autonomy and authority. I talk a little bit about how we define these things for ourselves, and I went through a bit of my definition of autonomy in the way that I look at it. Again, I think it's really important to note that this is for you to do your own free thinking. You are free to hear me out, hear out all these different philosophers, what they have to say, how they look at these things, and, make your own decisions on, whether or not you agree and how would you define it? What would you change about these different perspectives? It's a really great lesson in, personal agency, in free thinking and making your own decisions, which is essential to being an autonomous person. The primary debate within the philosophy of authority is, number one, what makes authority legitimate? Is it their ability to punish and coerce? Is it done through the consent of the people? What makes authority legitimate? And this is really, really important in the discussion of the cult leader and what makes them legitimate. What gives another person full authority over you, over everything in your life, what you'll wear, what you'll eat, who you're going to be, what you're going to think? Does anyone even have that kind of authority over another person? Number two, do people have a moral obligation to obey authority? And what is this justified in? A big question on authority here, why should we listen? And is this a moral duty that we have in the sense that, is this the right thing? Is it the right thing to always listen to authority? Or do we not listen to authority when it's making you do something not in line with your own values and your own beliefs? In the heart of the cult experience are these issues. It's authority versus autonomy. When you're in the cult experience, a lot of the time you don't even know that you're not free, right? You don't really realize a lot of the time you're going to think that you are there of your own free will, and these are your choices, and you are doing these things. And, that's the way it's set up. So it only makes sense for people to feel that way when they're in the cult experience, to feel that they're in control or something of what is happening around them and in control of their decisions. The discussion on authority and what makes it legitimate can be pretty complicated. So having some good solid definitions and, words that we can use along the way that are going to help us to understand these different concepts. So number one, normative authority is authority that has been morally justified and therefore legitimate. Number two, non-normative or de facto authority. De facto authority is not morally justified. It's more of an imposed authority than it is a chosen authority. And number 3, practical authority. So practical authority is just an authority that produces actions, in contrast with theoretical authority, which is authority that produces beliefs. Next, we have instrumentalism. So authority is legitimate insofar it achieves its desired outcomes, right? Better behaviors than if you had acted in accordance with your own autonomy. So if you were better off submitting to an authority because you are going to be making actions that are better than what you would have done otherwise, then that would be legitimate, right? So even if you weren't explicitly consenting to it, if you're better off, then that's legitimate. That's the instrumentalist perspective of authority. So then there's philosophical anarchism. So in anarchism, authority is a contradiction to autonomy. So autonomy trumps all. That is the right. Well, according to Robert Wolff's perspective. Wolff's perspective is it's like a moral obligation to uphold your autonomy. In Green's version of anarchism, it's more of this idea that we have that right not to, comply. Philosophical anarchism definitely is a totally different perspective. It's not really what, people think of anarchism, like more like maybe the state of nature, pure chaos. Speaking of the state of nature, so I would like to get into our first philosopher, which is Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes is a 17th century English philosopher, and he wrote the Leviathan. So according to Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, everyone without any sort of authority or government is in the state of nature. And the state of nature is essentially chaos, right? It's, absolute anarchism. It's a prisoner's dilemmas game where, if we cooperate with each other, obviously we're going to have the best payoffs. But in the state of nature, it's not cooperative. We are going to compete. So, do I steal his stuff before he steals my stuff? Right? Like, it is survival. It is war, essentially. And Thomas Hobbes thought, how do we get out of the state of nature? Well, we have to have some sort of sovereign, some absolute authority that sets the structure. That authority's obligation is to keep the peace, is to keep people safe, is for protection, right? It is to get us out of the state of nature. According to Hobbes, this is like an absolute power, right? And it's an absolute power that we essentially give up our rights to, give up our autonomy to, in exchange for peace and order. It's interesting too, because the sovereign has absolute power. So there's no like laws that the sovereign can break or anything, but the people, the only way out of that situation, according to Hobbes, even if the sovereign is not the greatest person, if it keeps us out of the state of nature, it's better than none, right? So the only way out of that, if it's a bad leadership going on, is reverting back to the state of nature. So the way the sovereign fails is by failing to keep the order and keep the peace and to protect the people, and the people revert back to the state of nature. So according to to Hobbes. I mean, this is the Hobbesian perspective. It is the most, one of the more prevalent perspectives you're going to learn about in philosophy. Very, very famous perspective and argument that he brought to the table about the state of nature. He could look at a cult leader and say, this authority is legitimate insofar it maintains the peace and the security, right? So in that way, it would be legitimate if that's what the cult's doing. The thing about the cult, though, is that there is inherent harm going on. A lot of the time, it really does depend, I guess. If we would look at Jonestown, that was the state of nature, literally, right? So in that sense, he would be like, no, that was a failed authority, is no longer legitimate. So I guess it just really depends on whether or not the cult leader is going to maintain safety, right? Maintain the structure and keep everyone out of the state of nature. All right, moving on to Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant is definitely one of my favorite philosophers. I think his perspectives are truly fascinating. He is a German philosopher from the 1700s, and he is extremely famous for his argument for the categorical imperative. This is Kant's perspective of how we should be making rational moral judgments. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative is basically universalizing any act as a law. So if everyone did this one thing, would it be a better world? This is the base foundation of autonomy, is being able to make these decisions from a place of rationality and from a place, where you are creating your own moral laws, in a sense. Let's say everyone in the world push their grandma down on the ground or something, right? Let's say everyone in the world did that. Could we really will that to be a universal law? Would that be a good thing? No. Would it be good if everyone in the world pushed their grandma down on the ground? No, it would not be. Let's say everyone in the world joined a cult and worked for free labor, everyone in the world. I can't imagine that would be something that would be good. If everyone worked for free, then that means that no one would have means. And also no one would be able to spend money even. Actually, in that case, if everyone in the world worked for free in a cult, there would be no money going in circulation even. People wouldn't be able to afford to go to the cult businesses or anything because everyone's working for free. Clearly, it would not be a good world. So therefore, that could never be a moral thing. That could never be good. So according to Kant, you must be a rational, free-thinking person. You have your own rational will, and that is what makes you an autonomous agent. Act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can, at the same time, will that become a universal law. This is very important in Kant's perspective of authority. So according to Kant, every person, has the right to be free. We have the right to freedom. That is an innate right that every individual has. So he would utilize social contracts. Social contracts are they're not written historical documents, right? They're social agreements between two people. And we make social contracts with people all the time, not even really realizing that we're doing that. So if it would be in the best interest to enter, a social contract into a kind of, authority situation where another person has the authority to regulate things over you. And that was for the best, and that would help you preserve your freedom. And it was in accordance with your freedom, then Kant would say that is legitimate. Another really, really important aspect of things is treating people as an ends in themselves and not a means to an end. So he was about fairness. He was about freedom. He was about looking at people and humanizing them and not treating them like a means to an end. Any government or any authority that treats their people like a means to an end is not legitimate, that it is not ethical as well. So, Kant, I would say, would have a huge problem with cults for these reasons. They do not respect your freedom. You are not able to rationally choose to be in a cult, right? Or to rationally, autonomously, be in that situation. Like Kant does not think so, right? So they're breaking principles, universal laws. They're not respecting your freedom as a free thinking, rational person. They look down on free thinking. When you question things in a cult, you are going to be met with so much resistance. You are not going to get those answers. It is discouraged. Immanuel Kant would never be okay with that. He might think that people maybe could. I don't think so. See, I don't think Kant would even think that you could autonomously agree to that, because there's so much coercion and deception. That could not possibly be rationality, So, yeah, I think Kant would definitely say, fuck that shit. Like, that is not freedom. You do not have a duty to obey when you are being deceived and when you are being coerced in such a way that is not in your best interest and in such a way that doesn't respect you as a free person, as an end in yourself. So, yeah, Immanuel Kant, definitely recommend looking into his philosophies. He's a really, really, really interesting philosopher. So, Plato is also an interesting philosopher. And I bring Plato up, I feel like, all the time, because there's just so many things that we talk about, and I can always find like something relevant with Plato in these different discussions I have with people. So Plato wrote the Republic. The Republic was basically what is an ideal government. He really wanted the philosopher king, right? He wanted it based in truth and knowledge of the forms. Plato's philosophies are all about the forms, which in Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave, they're chained, their backs are turned, and they're just facing the wall, and all they see are like the shadows on the walls. That is their perception of reality. And they don't even know that the puppeteers are behind them, and it's being orchestrated, right? Like, people didn't know that. And so the people who escape the cave see reality. They know truth. They have the knowledge of the forms. They experience that. And those are the people who Plato would say would be legitimate, right? Who could run a great society, who would be a good authority. So he would never base it in divinity. And I think this is really, really important. Co-leaders get their authority from God a lot of the time. And it's self-proclaimed and subjective. It's something that you're going to see thousands of people claiming, right? And when you have all these different people claiming to be, the ultimate authority, because that is what the cult leader is. They are your ultimate authority. They're not just a theoretical authority, they're also a practical authority too, right? They are influencing your beliefs and your actions. They are a religious authority to you at that point. They are a moral authority to you. So they want all the elements of being the authority, being the one truth, and where you gain your knowledge, which is from this one person. And it's not based in truth. Plato would reject cult leaders and openly rejected sophists who were essentially doing the same thing that cult leaders do, manipulating language, using persuasion instead of truth or facts or, reality, right? Their end goal was to win the argument, to be the best. And so Plato spoke out openly. He wrote several dialogues critiquing the sophists. Plato's dialogues are interesting because they're always Socrates sitting having like a discussion with some sophist or something, and doing that back and forth. And Plato believed in what would make society like thrive, right? So Plato also believed in noble lies. He distinguished between myths and noble lies. So to Plato, the myths in like Homer's Odyssey, for example, are harmful. They cause fear of death, or, the myths of the Greek gods. Plato thought they anthropomorphized the gods way too much. They made the gods seem imperfect and like humans. And, anything that would essentially program society to think a certain way, he would disagree with. Like if it made people more violent, like he would disagree with that. Those kinds of stories. But he also believed in stories that would strengthen society. So even if those stories weren't true, they were noble lies. They would bring strength to people. So, it's interesting, Plato's perspective. I do believe he would absolutely reject cult leaders as being any sort of authority at all in any way. The next philosopher I would like to discuss is John Stuart Mill. He is an English philosopher from the 1800s. And a very, very important aspect of his political philosophy, his perspective of authority, was utilitarianism. He was a utilitarian. And utilitarians, the objective in making a moral decision is to maximize utility. So they are maximizing the overall happiness. Whatever gives us the greatest utility, the greatest happiness, is the better option. One of the more famous examples of utilitarian thinking is the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is you got two tracks. One track, you got 5 people tied up. The other track, you got 1 person tied up. And you are standing next to a switch, right? And you can switch the train track to kill the 1 person instead of the 5 people. So it's heading straight toward the 5 people. If you think that saving the 5 people is the better option because there's more of them, right? It's like a greater utility, a greater outcome, greater happiness, and losing 1 compared to losing 5, right? then that is like a utilitarian mindset. But if you would choose not to pull the switch and not to switch the train track and let it take its course and kill the 5 people, that would be more of a deontological perspective. Deontology is more about the rules and less about the consequences, right? So if you were to pull that lever, that means that you actually kill that one person. In comparison, had you not touched the lever at all, like your hands are clean in a sense, right? So these are just different moral perspectives, which we're going to get deeper into in a different episode on DisAllusioned Podcast. It's a really important topic, especially for cult survivors recovering and trying to figure that out, like, because someone else is always telling you it's right and wrong. And like, how do we think about that stuff? How do I make these moral decisions, my own free thinking, and the ways that cult leaders can manipulate these ways of thinking as well. Again, utilitarianism, like, are we going to torture, the terrorist's kid in order to get him to tell us which hospital the bomb's in to save, 20,000 kids in the hospital? So like, it gets very deep and very complex, but it's, a great way to help you to think about things a little bit differently. So John Stuart Mill, he really would base legitimacy in this no harm principle. As long as the authority was doing no harm, that's legitimate, right? It's based in rationality, promotes free thinking, individual liberties. John Stuart Mill was huge into, women's suffrage, freedom of speech, and having safeguards for people who were less privileged. So he has a really interesting perspective. And I truly doubt that John Stuart Mill would ever sit and think that any kind of cult would have any legitimate authority over anyone else. I mean, the no harm principle would be absolutely broken, because that is what cults do, that they harm. That is why we're out here doing what we're doing and talking about it, because they're dangerous. They tear families apart. They take away your liberties and your freedom of thought, and your freedom to speak, and all of those things. According to John Stuart Mill, it's a hell no. That is not legitimate. You have no moral obligation to obey such authority. They're not legitimate authority. And you need to be able to be free of coercion, right? Coercion is an absolute violation of personal liberty. So far, I don't see many philosophers who would agree that cults could be legitimate authority. But at the end of the day, though, I'm sure there are philosophers who would think so. I mean, and even some of these philosophers in certain contexts might say yes, like Hobbes would say yes, they are legitimate if they're keeping us out of the state of nature, right? Is the state of nature better option? If that's a better option, then this is not legit, right? Which I would argue probably 99% of the time cults might not be the better option. The state of nature, I guess that really depends, but then you have Immanuel Kant, like that would be a no. They violate all of his principles, his categorical imperative, and it just doesn't work. Plato as well, it's going to be a no. But again, I'm sure there are philosophers, it just depends. It's very context specific. And they all have very, very, very specific requirements. It captures the complexity of it all, because there's so many different factors going on here and so many different ways to approach it. And, to define authority and autonomy and consent and all these things, right? Different ways to think about things. And it's awesome to be able to look at these different perspectives, right? To help us to be critical thinkers, to help us to be independent, free-thinking people, especially after a cult experience. One of the biggest challenges for any cult survivor is finding your autonomy again, finding that agency. What do you like? What are you into? How do you want to dress? What are your values? What are your principles and beliefs? And, that can be just so overwhelming and so confusing to figure that all out. And, a lot of the time you don't even know how unconscious the programming is from the cult experience and how much it can influence these things. So it's so important to sit down and really, reflect on things and look at different perspectives. Do not sit in an echo chamber. It is the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. We need all these different perspectives. We need Kant's perspective. We need Mill's. We need Waldron's perspective. We need all these philosophers and just all these people who give us debate, discussion, and, help us to be skeptical when we need to be skeptical. So finding your agency again and being an autonomous person, it's a huge challenge, especially for my people pleasers out there. Like, people pleasing is tough, man. It is a hard thing to conquer, and in your people pleasing era, you literally can get yourself in just really unpleasant situations. And I think understanding authority in other people, right? That other people don't have that authority over you. That you don't have to say yes all the time. You don't have to do things for people. Some of these perspectives put autonomy at the very fucking top, right? That trumps all. That would trump anything else. Your freedom. So your freedom to help if you want to help, right? Not because you have to help or something like that. And, your freedom to critique things and to make your own decisions that's going to help you to be more self-aware, be more conscious about, giving up your liberties for others needlessly, or, not valuing yourself enough, or not valuing what you want in life or in general. Even if it's small decisions, use those small decisions to practice your agency. Like, what do you want to eat? What restaurant do you want to go to? Like, don't just give up that decision to another person. Oh, I don't care. You pick, right? We'll almost gravitate towards people who will direct our lives because, finding that kind of structure again, autonomous structure in your life where you are organizing and orchestrating your life and making your decisions is, it's tough. But again, you can get through that. You can get through it by educating yourself, looking at other perspectives, and learning about your boundaries and, who has the rights. And, what are your rights? Your rights are absolutely essential to be aware of. Those things keep you out of those bad situations. So, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. But next time, we'll definitely probably get deeper into moral reasoning and kind of the implications of these different perspectives on, our decisions and in relation to the cult experience. But thank you guys so much for watching DisAllusioned Podcast, and I will see you next time.